Today, we invite you to hear a debate between one of the world's foremost philosophical atheists, Dr. Antony Flew, former professor of Oxford University, and Christian philosopher and historian Dr. Gary Habermas, current chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Liberty University, on the topic, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead?
For a person like myself, confronted with an apparent miracle, the rational thing is to think that there must be some mistake here. Though I could be persuaded that a miracle occurred, it would need something really very spectacular.
Probably the single most important fact is that the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus.
Well, obviously, you're taking that in a naturalistic way, so give me your theory. How did that happen? I mean, something happened, is what everybody's saying.
Oh, yeah. I take it that these were related visions, and there was nothing there that anybody else could have seen.
I think Tony's getting himself in a lot of hot water. Number one, he's got an empty tomb with no cause ventured for the tomb. No. Secondly, he's got hallucinations for the disciples that don't work for the half dozen reasons I gave earlier. Groups don't see hallucinations. They weren't in the right frame of mind. You have different times, places, people, gender, doing different things. The empty tomb, it doesn't transform lives. James, Paul, all.
What I want to raise is what it was that Paul actually saw. What he thought he saw was the risen Christ. But what was there to be seen? And his companions apparently didn't see the risen Christ or anything else.
Every critic believes that the disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus. So here's the issue. If the disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus, and hallucinations don't work, as far as we know, nothing else works. All we have is this is an incredible event.
Christianity stands or falls on Christ's resurrection. If Christ has risen from the dead, then Christianity is true. If he did not, then Christianity is false. Even the Apostle Paul wrote, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is groundless, your preaching is useless, and you are still in your sins. We invite you to join us for this important debate on the John Ankerberg Show. We're glad that you joined us. My guests are two world-class philosophers, and they're going to debate the crucial question, did Jesus rise from the dead? In this first segment, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about these fellows so you know who they are. My first guest is Dr. Antony Flew, probably the world's most famous philosophical atheist. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Reading in England. He's also held permanent professorships in philosophy at the University of Kiel, King's College, University of Aberdeen, Christ Church at Oxford University, and has been a visiting professor at 12 universities around the world. He holds the MA degree from St. John's College, University of Oxford, and a Doctor of Literature from the University of Kiel. He has authored more than 23 books, edited 12 others, written more than 72 articles in prestigious journals. Those are just the ones that I could count. If you look in your Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the article on miracles was written by Dr. Flew because he is probably, or arguably, the Hume scholar in the world right now. And my second guest is Dr. Gary Habermas. He's chairman of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at the Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. Gary received a Doctor of Divinity from Emmanuel College, Oxford, England, and a PhD from Michigan State University. He's authored 21 books, published over 110 articles in prestigious journals. And gentlemen, I'm glad that you are here. We're going to have a great conversation together. And Dr. Habermas, I think the people that are watching right now, we're talking about, did Jesus rise from the dead? They're saying, come on. I mean, you're saying there's evidence, there's facts in history. When you see magazines like Newsweek and Time that come out every 6-8 months, it seems, here's another one on visions of Jesus. You've got all kinds of stuff in these magazines, but they keep on saying there's very little evidence. Now, you come along and you write this little book called The Historical Jesus, and all of a sudden, you talk about the fact that when you were at Michigan State working on your PhD, you were a skeptic yourself. And the fact is, the facts brought you to a belief in Jesus. And you have said there are at least 12 historical facts that are virtually by all critical scholars today. I'd like you to let us know what the case is. Start us off tonight.
Well, John, just to name some of those highlights, virtually everybody today thinks that Jesus died due to crucifixion. I mean, John Crossan and others from the Jesus Seminar say that's the most widely known fact in the ancient world. Mm-hmm. He was buried. He, of course, this event inspired some despair in the disciples. Now, the fact that the tomb was empty is admitted by most scholars, but not as widely admitted as the rest in this list. Probably the single most important fact is that the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. They were transformed as a result. The resurrection was a central message. They preached in Jerusalem. The church was born. We have some individuals like James and Paul, two former skeptics, one a family skeptic, one an outsider who persecuted Christians. And they also came to Christ by experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. And by the way, there's a lot of other scholars today in the historical Jesus movement, way far to the left of me, who also start with lists of facts just like this as sort of a common ground from which we can deal with our data.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tony, what do you think about Habermas's facts there?
Well, I don't dispute those facts, but I want to say yes, but. And the evidential situation is, in many ways, very unsatisfactory. For a start, no one knows in what year the crucial event of the crucifixion and consequently the other events occurred. And this is a very remarkable thing. That no one knows the birth date. Well, there are a great many birth dates of important people that are not known. The other lack is all our evidence is based on documents written by believing Christians, none of whom was himself an eyewitness. And we have absolutely nothing from the rest of the population of Jerusalem to tell us why it was they weren't converted and whether the earthquakes and other alleged miracles actually occurred or not.
Well, what do you think about that, Gary?
Well, now when you say there's none of these early Christian authors are eyewitnesses, of course, I think from your writings you exempt Paul, right? You believe the Apostle Paul wasn't eyewitness.
I was thinking of the Gospel writers.
Right. But with Paul we have an authentic eyewitness, and you would grant a number of authentic Pauline books.
Oh, yeah.
And, but
he wasn't in Jerusalem, of course, at that time.
Well, shortly afterwards, of course, he was there when Stephen was stoned. But, and also I would disagree about the extra-biblical data. I think we do have extra-biblical data for most everything. I will say that everything on that factual list that I gave, everything except probably the despair of the disciples, which is a good psychological fact, but all the rest of them can be established through Paul alone. And, but I think the majority of them can also be witnessed to in ancient extra-biblical literature.
All right, well, give us an example. Give us some of the data.
Well, 1 Corinthians 15, I think, without any question, is the central piece of evidence. And that's from the far right to the far left. I mean, I remember being reviewed by a pretty radical scholar, I think to the left of Tony, who said Habermas doesn't have any good evidence for the resurrection except 1 Corinthians 15. And I think you can't say that and disavow the resurrection, because 1 Corinthians 15 is incredible data, written by Paul, very early, 55 to 57 AD, but more importantly in verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that he received material that he passed on to others. And that data there is, those words, by the way, delivered and received, are technical words for passing on tradition. And when you piece this together, it is most likely that Paul received that material in Jerusalem from Peter and James. Now that, according to Paul's own account in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, where the word he uses shows that he played the part of the investigative reporter, and the immediate context after is the nature of the gospel. So I think that we have Paul being converted 1 to 1.5 years after the cross. That's the date critics use. 3 years later, he goes to Jerusalem. So we're talking 35-ish AD, if we use a nice round year, 30 for the cross. 35 years, 35 AD, 5 years later, he gets this material from Peter and James. So as ancient history goes, this is a very, very early move.
And what was the key thing that Peter gave to Paul that he recorded?
Well, it seems that from Peter and James, Paul got this list of appearances in 1 Corinthians 15. And by the way, besides Paul, Peter and James are the only two eyewitnesses named by name in Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15. So there's a fairly tight network. And when we look at ancient history, I mean, I think of the German critical historian Hans von Kampenhausen, who says in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, we have material that meets all standards of historicity that could possibly be applied to an ancient text. And he's fairly far over on the left. So, I mean, I'm sure Tony doesn't believe what Paul's saying, but I'm saying that we have this from a very early time, and I think that's very, very important.
Tony, what do you think about this being eyewitness stuff then from Paul?
I have not the slightest doubt that he is reporting something that happened to him with certain companions. But what he was reporting was that he was in contact, or he thought he was seeing the resurrected Christ and so on. But his companions didn't see anything at all, did they?
No,
There's a doubt as to whether they heard a voice.
Well, first of all, I'm saying the companions with Paul, this idea that they didn't see the same thing he saw, that's only in the book of Acts. We don't get that from Paul. So I'm saying if you're going to admit Acts there, that gives me a wealth of other material to use from the book of Acts too. But my other point, I would disagree with you that I think Paul thinks Jesus appeared to him physically. And I'd love to show that to you from Paul's own writings if you want to. But
we're going to take a break and we're going to come back. We're debating the topic, did Jesus rise from the dead? And we're talking about the Apostle Paul, the information he got from James and Peter, and what kind of a resurrection took place. Was it a spiritual one? Was it a physical one? Was it a hallucination one? Was it something else? We'll talk about it more when we come right back. All right, we're back, and we're talking with two wonderful guests, Dr. Antony Flew, considered by many to be the world's foremost philosophical atheist, and Dr. Gary Habermas, a renowned Christian philosopher and historian, considered by many to be the foremost expert on the evidence for the Jesus resurrection. Now, why is it important to have this core of 12 facts that virtually all critical scholars, this is not evangelicals here, we're talking virtually all critical scholars out there, drive this in. First of all, why do they accept this data?
Well, I think they accept it because it comes on good grounds. Today, Paul is widely accepted, as Tony has said. Virtually everything in the list can be established by Paul alone, and everybody thinks something can be gathered from the Gospels and Acts here and there. So I think it comes on good evidence. Now, why these 12? This is just something that I came up with in Historical Jesus. Others might have a list that's longer or shorter.
And if people question these, Gary, from what I understand in your book, is all of these 12, there's a ton of evidence that supports all of these from history, and we can get into that as well.
We could look at any one of them.
Now, Tony, you would agree that these 12 facts are accepted by the scholars?
Yeah.
All right. Now, the question is, we've got these facts. Now, what conclusion do we draw from them? Tony, what do you draw from this?
From this alone, leaving out Paul, nothing of any great interest. No.
All right. So the fact is, one of those, if I remember correctly, and I'll just roll to it, the disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, you're taking that in a naturalistic way, so give me your theory. How did that happen? I mean, something happened, is what everybody's saying.
Oh, yeah. My best suggestion is that these were grief-related visions. Apparently, these are fairly common. People who've lost a wife or close relative and are feeling distressed about it suddenly have the feeling, I think, seem to see the familiar person around the house and so on.
Yeah.
I take it that these were grief-related visions, and there was nothing there that anybody else could have seen.
You just wrote a review for Jack Kent's book on the psychological origins of the resurrection myth, right? And that's, I think, they're out or coming out in Free Inquiry magazine and a couple others. In essence, he was saying that there's two reasons that he attributes for the experiences that these disciples had. Grief hallucination for the disciples, and conversion psychosis for Paul. You want to go with that?
I think, well, I don't know about conversion psychosis, but clearly it was the sort of thing that William James in Varieties of Religious Experience would be writing about. what happens in the cases of these rather spectacular religious conversions. Most people's conversions to or from a religion are much more slow-moving and so on, but there are a lot of these cases, many of which are found in that great work of William James.
Let me clarify why this is so important. 15 years ago, you two fellas had a wonderful debate. You know, most of us, we missed it. I got to read that in the book and so on, but it was a tremendous debate. But Jack Kent, the fellow that you are writing the review for, said that all dozen of the facts by Habermas that were presented by Habermas are great facts. The problem is Flew did not have a theory to explain those facts, and he lost the debate. Now, is this the theory that you want to go with?
Yes.
All right.
This is what I think I've learnt in the last 15 years. I hope I've learnt some other things besides that, but this is the relevant one.
All right, you guys are buddies, so stick it to your buddy up there. Now, Gary, the fact is hallucination's been around for a long time, but this is a kind of specific area of hallucination. We've got, this grief hallucination for the disciples. Kind of explain what that is, and conversion psychosis for the Apostle Paul. Does that float?
And I think it doesn't come close. And let me take them in reverse order. Let me go with Paul. Jack Kent tells you that Paul has a conversion disorder, he calls it. What he does not tell you, I mean, it's a real convenient category because most people don't know anything about conversion disorder. He cites the DSM-3, which is the standard diagnostic tool for psychiatry. The fourth one is out, but at any rate, the DSM-4, if Paul has conversion disorder on the way to Damascus, we're going to have multiple problems. And he doesn't tell you this. Number one, there's nothing in the diagnostic literature about hallucination. It is simply a very violent and fast change of mind. It's short-lived, and it goes away. So conversion disorder will not do it, even for a critic. You have to have conversion disorder, and this is even from Kemp's book. Plus, you have to have an auditory hallucination of hearing. You have to have a visual hallucination of sight. And lastly, Paul has to be caught by a great psychosis, which is often called the Messiah complex, because then Paul goes out and says, God spoke to me, and he told me to tell you. So 4 things have to happen simultaneously. A conversion disorder, 2 different kinds of hallucination, and a Messiah complex have to hit him at one time, and then basically drift away, and we never see this again. And let me also tell you that in a standard reference work by Kaplan and 2 other psychiatrists, conversion disorder, watch the facts here and see if this sounds like Paul to you. Up to 5 to 1, it happens to women. It happens mostly to adolescents. It happens mostly to people of low economic status. It happens to people with a low IQ and to military persons in battle. That's the 5 most common circumstances. Not a single one applies to Paul. So when you say you've got these 5 problems, but plus he needs the disorder, 2 hallucinations, Messiah complex, and let's just add here, there is not a speck of evidence in Paul that he ever wanted to convert from Judaism to Christianity. I think you've got a horrible problem.
Roll on to grief hallucination. What about that one?
Well, okay, grief hallucinations, according to Jack Kent, apply to the disciples and James. And by the way, he would like you to think that this is in the literature. There's no such thing as grief hallucination in the DSM-4. Nothing. Now, Tony's right. People do see hallucinations, but what's the MO? A person who sees a grief hallucination is alone. Usually, let's picture an elderly lady who's lost her husband. She's alone in her room at night. And as a lady I remember from a church I pastored, she used to say, "Where's Daddy, where's Daddy?" And she walked around the house, and that's all she said. She's a candidate, perhaps, for a grief hallucination. But you've got problems with groups of people seeing Jesus. Right there in 1 Corinthians 15, you've got 3 groups of people. You've got the fact that they had despair. Hallucinations don't come out of despair. So hallucinations when you believe something so strongly you make the image. Even with Paul alone, you've got too many different people, persons, places. You've got women, men, indoors, outdoors, walking, sitting, standing. We can go on. You've got an empty tomb. By the way, I've got a friend who's done some research on hallucination. They do not cause, as a general rule, they do not cause any kind of transformation. People who have these get talked out of them. Somebody says, "No, come on, you're not seeing your husband," and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, you're right."
What do you think,
talk
Tony?
Right out of them.
Well, about the particular psychological transformation, I'm not going to try and be an expert on this. It seems to me that there was plenty of reason for Paul to be upset. After all, he had been involved in persecuting Christians, and sometimes people have changes of mind in this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, how would we get Paul wanting to convert so much that he's on the way to Damascus to imprison or kill Christians, and without any evidence from his writings, he wants to change. He doesn't fit any of those people groups. Mm-hmm. But my big problem is that he has to have 4 problems at the same time: conversion disorder, auditory hallucination, visual hallucination, and a Messiah complex, because he says, God spoke to me and I have a message for everybody in the world. That's 4. That's pretty complicated theory to have 4 things happen. But my point was, conversion disorder, these other things don't come from conversion disorder in the DSM. So you've got to have 4 simultaneous problems at the same time. I just think that's highly improbable that would all happen to a man without cause from his own writings.
Yeah. What grounds would Kent give in terms of saying that from the data, from the evidence, he would do those things? Because we don't seem to get that picture from the Apostle Paul. Isn't that more hypotheses?
Well, yes, it certainly is. I mean, in view of the enormous shortage of evidence from any non-Christian source, you can't expect to produce with any great confidence conclusions about what actually happened there. You know, the list of things that we've got, okay, this is what we've got evidence for, but it's against a great background of enormous ignorance about everything there. I think the most one can reasonably hope to do is to suggest some way of interpreting the evidence that we have got without postulating a physical body being actually seen and being visible to anyone who happened to be there and photographable if cameras had been invented
All right.
1,000 years earlier.
We're going to pick that up, but Gary, summarize where we've been, at least for this program. And what I'd like to do is then go to the crux of the matter, what Tony's talking about, in terms of what about other ancient historical information? What about that? There are 4 key historical facts that you've put in the book that you've pulled out of the 12 that you say are supported by a ton of evidence over here, 129 different quotes from like 44, 49 different sources. We need to talk about that, but just wrap up where we're at right now.
Well, what we have on the table is that Tony is using the thesis of Jack Kent and saying that the disciples in James had hallucinations, grief hallucinations, and Paul had a conversion disorder. I think the facts are grossly against both occurring. And Tony's right. There's a lot of things we don't know here. But the problem is the things we do know militate against both of these in great amounts of facts, I think. Everything. Psychiatry, psychology, history. But you're right. I think the 4 key facts that I assume we'll come back to, I think we're getting close now to the resurrection, because out of that list of 12, we have some data that point to the fact that it was Jesus that they saw.
All right. Now, stay with us, because in our next segment, we're going to talk about 4 key historical facts that are supported by ancient sources, and I think you won't want to miss that. Welcome. We're discussing the topic, did Jesus rise from the dead? And we're talking with 2 wonderful guests. Dr. Antony Flew, considered by many to be the world's foremost contemporary philosophical atheist. And Dr. Gary Habermas, a renowned Christian philosopher and historian, considered by many to be the foremost expert on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And guys, I just appreciate you being here. We want to jump right to the crux of the matter. Do we have historical evidence to prove that Jesus actually lived? Did he die on a cross? What about the disciples? Did they have experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus? You've got 4, Dr. Habermas, that you have said out of the 12 that you presented in our last segment that all contemporary or all critical scholars would basically agree with these facts. There's a ton of evidence. We need some of that evidence, but first of all, what are the facts?
Well, what I did, John, from this list of 12 facts surrounding the, from, let's say, Friday in the life of Jesus traditionally, I've taken 4. Now, it's an arbitrary number because, to my knowledge, nobody would give you as few as 4. I mean, Rudolf Bultmann probably gives you 20 from this last week, half a week in Jesus' life. But what I've done is I think there are 4 facts out of the 12 that do 3 things. First of all, I think that these, couple other of the 12 facts, but these in particular, you can refute the major naturalistic theories using nothing but the data surrounding these facts. Secondly, you've got the best evidences for the resurrection here. And third, you're doing all of it with a very small kernel of historical data. So you're not requiring the Gospels or this or that. This all comes from Paul.
Okay, what are they? What are the facts?
Well, the first one is that Jesus died due to the rigors of crucifixion. Secondly, that the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Thirdly, their lives were changed. They were transformed. They undeniably believed that Jesus saw them and they turned the world upside down. And fourthly, a man named Paul, as we've discussed, a skeptic, a critic who killed Christians and imprisoned them, came to Christ by an experience that he believed.
All right, now Tony next to you would be saying that, hey, if you're not a Christian, some of those facts, or Tony, you tell them. Would you agree with all those facts?
Yes, I think I would.
Okay.
But these literal appearances, I'm very much a sympathizer of the Thomas, who appears very late, really, in the Gospel story, with doubts as to whether there is an actual physical body there. And as far as I can see, there's nothing said to say that he actually did put his hands in and find it. He's told he ought to do, and then it's reported that then Jesus is reported as saying that he had seen, rather than that he had actually felt the body.
Gary, what do you think?
Well, he tells Thomas to touch him. Tony's right. John does not tell us that Thomas touched him. I would add the following, though. Ignatius, just perhaps 10 years after the Gospel of John, 107 A.D., Ignatius says at that point that Thomas did touch him. Be that as it may, we've got 2 earlier accounts of women touching Jesus from the Gospels. One is the women as a whole who take Jesus by the ankles in Matthew 28:9. And we've got the case of Mary Magdalene, who comes back alone, and she thinks he's the gardener, and she turns around and sees him, and she knows it's him, and he says, "Stop clinging to me." So I get this picture of Mary holding him for all she's worth. So we have the women touching him, Mary touching him, and at least Ignatius says Thomas touched him.
Not only that, but the fact is, if you're going to use the account about Thomas, where I won't believe, okay, you have a skeptic there, I won't believe until I can put my hands right into the nail prints and see the side. Okay, whatever happened, you have his testimony after he said that, "My Lord, my God." So something happened. What do you think?
Well, it is curious that Jesus is reported as saying not, so now you've touched, you believe, and so on. But he was saying that he'd seen. It's a very peculiar thing to my mind. It's not the way that I would have written a report if I'd been there and seen someone actually touching after the...
What about the women? In the 2 accounts, the women and Mary Magdalene alone, do you think they touched him?
These are accounts that they did. Yes, indeed. But that we have an account that they touched him is not a decisive reason to believe that he was touched. This is what they were reported as having done.
But you'd have more to complain about if no one touched him in the Gospels.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely.
At least
Yeah.
we have these three cases,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
Ignatius
But
says Thomas touched him.
It is
So.
remarkably little, actually. After all, we will all presumably remember, art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? You know, this is surely the first thing anyone would do if they were wondering whether the vision was a seeing of something that was there that other people could see and touch and so on,
By the
or
way,
not.
if you're going to admit the data from the Gospels there, the same author of the fourth Gospel, 1 John, starts out the first 3 verses and says, we've seen him with our eyes, our hands have touched him, we've beheld the Word that, in John 1:14, the Word was made flesh. So John comes back in the first epistle, if you like, that material.
Let me read it to you here. 6 times he says, we have seen something. 6 times we have heard something. And he says, that which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, the Greek is scrutinized, and our hands have touched.
So
Now,
Paul-
Jesus, I think in
Yeah.
Luke, wasn't it, where Jesus said, touch
Right.
me and see that I'm not a ghost.
Yes.
And eats.
Yeah. So the evidence seems to show that we have a literal physical body going on here that the boys were a little bit surprised to see in the first place, but it took them quite a few experiences, and they did touch, they did see, and that's what they're claiming.
It's not they didn't touch there, sure. They saw a vision of someone eating, didn't they?
Well, he says there, that which we touched,
Well, if you like,
Yeah.
if you like the straightforward account, in Luke 24, Jesus said, "A spirit hath not flesh and bones as ye
Yeah.
see me have." So he's
Oh,
saying,
yes.
"I'm not a spirit." If we take the Gospels, straightforwardly,
Well, the Spirit is claiming not to be a spirit.
that since he's saying he's not a spirit, I assume that means he's not a spirit.
Why is it? There are some people, Gary, that would say that, the resurrection is you go into a lot of churches across the country, the minister in that church would say, this is not a physical, literal resurrection of Jesus from the dead. This is what they call a spiritual resurrection from the dead. Why not? Why not just a spiritual resurrection?
Well, this is the earlier point that I was at odds with Tony. I would say today, it's a statement whenever you try to tell us where scholars are today, but I'm currently studying 100 sources on the resurrection from 1975 to 2000 to see if I can get a feel for where critical scholars are. And by far, most scholars today think something really happened. The disciples had real experiences. They believed they saw the risen Jesus. And most of these scholars think the disciples really saw something. They had real experiences. But the majority of scholars who will admit, even some of them think even Jesus appeared there, they shy away from the physical body. And they think, I don't know, these are my words, but maybe some kind of shimmering hologram or something. So that's probably the typical approach today from skeptics that are somewhere in between the two of us.
Another word that people would usually say is, hey, Paul uses the word spiritual in 1 Corinthians 15.
Right.
Does he mean spiritual in the sense of some ethereal kind of wispy kind of see-through thing, or is this a literal physical body? What do the words mean there?
This is crucial for us because we believe that, now we've been playing around here with the Gospels a little bit, but we would both say Paul is by far the best evidence.
Right.
He's the only eyewitness, and that's what everybody says today. So what Paul thinks about the resurrection body is crucial. Now, just to note there in 1 Corinthians 15, there's obviously a Greek word for spirit, pneuma. Paul doesn't choose that word. He says spiritual body. So I assume there's some change going on, but the idea is there's a physical body there. Now, to show my earlier comment, I would not think that Paul is saying Jesus appeared as a spirit. And if you want me to give that to you briefly, in a Pauline book accepted by all critics, Philippians, by the way, critics almost always accept Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Philippians. G.A. Wells, who's probably to the left of Tony, he accepts 8 of Paul. He accepts those 5 and 3 others. In Philippians chapter 3,
I'm going to ask you to hold on to those, and we'll take a break, and we'll come right back and hear the reasons why it's not a spiritual resurrection, but a physical resurrection. Hang in there with us. All right, we're back. Thanks for joining us. We're with Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Anthony Flew. We're debating the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? And we're on this thing of What kind of resurrection happened? If you do say that Jesus came forth from the dead, what kind of body was there? Was it a spiritual body? What does that mean? Is it a physical body? What happened?
Well, and I was saying, I think this is crucial to talk about Paul here because everybody admits the Pauline data. Critic after critic says there's no eyewitness data except Paul. And so it's important to know what Paul thinks he saw on the way to Damascus. Now, I had said before that in 1 Corinthians 15, he could have chosen the word pneuma. He doesn't. He does say spiritual. He's got an adjective there, but he says soma, body. Philippians chapter 3, it's a short chapter, 21 verses, but Paul says three things in one chapter that indicates that he's talking about a physical resurrection. In the opening verses, he says, I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, and as touching the law, he said, I was a Pharisee. Now, it's very well known that the Pharisees believed in a bodily resurrection. In fact, according to Acts chapter 23, as Paul was being taken captive by the Romans to prevent him getting killed, he shouted out to the group of people and he said, why are you taking me? Because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. He means a literal resurrection. And the Pharisees there said, there's nothing wrong with this guy, but the Sadducees don't like it. So as a Pharisee, he's agreeing with the Pharisees. So first evidence from Philippians 3, as a Pharisee, he believes in a physical resurrection. Secondly, in verse 11, he says that I may attain the resurrection of the dead. Now, the normal Greek word for resurrection is anastasis. But in this passage, Philippians 3:11, he puts a prefix on there, ek anastasis. Ek anastasis, according to all Greek scholars that I know of, they translate this passage as the out-resurrection from among the dead. Paul says that I want to attain the out-resurrection. Now, to a Jew, out-resurrection means what goes down is what comes up. You come out from the death. And then just a few verses later, Philippians 3:20 and 21, he says, we look from heaven for Jesus, who will change our vile soma, body, to be like unto his glorious soma, or body, when he should have said pneuma, according to this other view. So he's a Pharisee, physical resurrection, ek anastasis, resurrection from out among the dead ones. And 3, he says he will change my body to be like his body. So right there in Philippians 3 alone, I think this picture of Paul, of Jesus being some wispy spirit that appeared to him in Damascus, doesn't fit Paul's own data.
Tony, you are just the most lovable person, and you're an empiricist. I mean, you got to follow the evidence. What do you do with this evidence?
Well, I find the idea of a spiritual body very peculiar, in that, after all, when you say something is spiritual, it's rather like saying it's immaterial. You're not, well, if you say it's immaterial, you're not telling us of any characteristic at all that you know of that it has. It seems to me that an immaterial substance is really nothing at all, and a spiritual body seems to me not to be a body at all.
All right, let me ask you a question. If I say the Bible is a spiritual book, does it mean that it's not a material thing?
No.
Well, could it be a spiritual body and still be a physical body?
Well, it might be the body of someone you would say was a spiritual person.
Here?
Yeah, he's direct. He's exactly right. It's an ontological comment, not a behavioral comment. However, I think the issue here is Tony is looking at the phrase spiritual body with 20th century or analytic eyes, and I think Paul has to describe what he means by spiritual body. And he's already said from Philippians 3, I'm a Pharisee, so I believe the resurrection of the body. 2, ekanastasis, out from among the dead ones. And 3, he calls it, he will change my vile body to be like his. Now there it's glorious body. It's not spiritual body in Philippians 3, 20, 21. It's glorious body. So now you've got body plus something else, I suppose some kind of glory, but not than a body. So maybe the problem is we're looking at this word spiritual with our 20th century eyes. But I guess here's the issue. If Paul is clear in Philippians 3 that this is not some wispy spirit, then we can't have the problem of saying, but this is non-physical, because he's telling us what he means by it. I take Philippians 3 to be a bit of a commentary on 1 Corinthians 15.
Gary, apply this. In other words, so far we've got an intellectual discussion here on the evidence, but I'm going to throw in the personal note, Tony, if you don't mind. Let's hear what Gary has to say. 95, your wife, Debbie, that every one of your students that I've seen letters and heard about said that you guys had a love affair that was made in heaven. And yet she came down, 40-some years of age, with what?
Stomach cancer. Yeah, Tony was in my house in 1985, and just yesterday we were talking about this because he didn't know what had happened. But my wife passed away in the summer of 1995, 10 years after we met, 10 years after he was in the house, with stomach cancer. And, you know, my first thought, you mentioned my skepticism earlier, I literally thought to myself, oh, no, and here comes the doubts again. And they never came. But I had a graduate student who's now on our faculty who called me at the time and he said, where would you be right now if it weren't for the resurrection? And for me, Paul's point there about mourning, Christians mourn, but not as those without hope. It makes all the difference in the world whether you mourn with hope or without hope. We all despair when we lose a loved one, as this point about the disciples. But, you know, to me, mourning my wife without the resurrection and mourning my wife with the resurrection makes all the difference in the world. So to me, the answer to my questions in 1995, when something like this, if this is a world in which God has raised Jesus from the dead, then if that's true in 30 AD, it's still true in 1995, and I could rest assured I didn't know the answer. I don't know the answer to pain and suffering. I don't know anybody does, theist or atheist. We don't know the answers of pain and suffering. But with something like the resurrection, it made existential sense to me because it said something about her, where she was going.
Well, spiritual, physical, what kind of way do you expect to see your wife then?
Right now, I think she's existing without a body, but I think we will be together and she will have a body, as I will.
So what happens when absent from the body is to be present with the Lord? What does that mean?
I think at the moment of death, before the Lord returns, believers are in the presence of the Lord without a physical body.
Okay.
I've got a friend, a philosopher, Buddy Peter Kreft at Boston College, who says, Plato was right as far as he went. He just didn't go far enough. Plato believed in disembodied state. What Plato did not believe in was a re-embodied state. And I think Orthodox Jews and Christians share that same hope.
All right, Tony, come on back. In terms of the information, we're still debating the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? If the disciples saw something, what do you think? With the evidence that they gave, were they lying?
Oh, good heavens, no, because lying involves intention.
So they didn't intend to lie.
Well, to lie, you intend to say something which is false.
Do you think the guys didn't intend to, but gave different information than what they really meant?
Well, Tony's mentioned a very key point here. What I indicated earlier was the key list for me on that list of 12, is that the disciples had experiences which they believed, not lied, but they believed they'd seen the risen Jesus. The crux of this discussion, I think the closest we will get to an answer, is the question, what did they see? The disciples claimed it was something visual. Now, Tony's view, hallucinations in two different kinds, also claim something visual, but something visual for which there is no external referent. I think you have a problem here, because if Paul is not a victim of conversion disorder, and if the disciples are not good candidates for hallucinations, and yet we admit the disciples thought they saw something, you're running out of possibilities.
What do you think, Tony?
Well, it may be that we are here confronted with something of which we have no other experience, because I find, perhaps here one has to raise the question, in considering any alleged miracle, what it is rational for you to do depends on what your prior beliefs were. For a person like myself, confronted with an apparently miracle, the rational thing is to think that there must be some mistake here. Though I could be persuaded that a miracle occurred, it would need something really very spectacular. But, of course, for people in Jerusalem, who were virtually all believing Jews of some sort, either Sadducee or Pharisee or not, the question of what it is rational to believe is entirely different, because they all were committed to the idea that a Messiah was going to come and that the Messiah would work miracles and so on. So I think you could argue that it was entirely rational for all these people to believe this is so, and of course for Christian believers now it may be rational to take this as a miraculous
All right, we're going to
thing,
follow up more.
whereas it isn't for me.
We've got about 30 seconds. One final statement.
So if I heard you right, Christians at least are rational in believing the resurrection.
I think that could be said, yes.
I think that's incredible, and a credible mission, but an honest admission from an honest man, because Tony's a very honest person. I've always found him to be that way. But I think that's great evidence, because if we're rational, then that means we've got reasons for it. Maybe we'll find out why Tony...
for your belief in God.
Yes, well, reasons for belief in God, too. I'd like to find out why he doesn't think those reasons are good
All
for
right,
him.
stick with us. We're going to talk about this more in our next segment that's coming up. We're going to talk about the empty tomb and what that has to do with this whole thing. We'll talk about it then. Stick with us. Welcome. We have two guests today that are very special, that are debating the topic, did Jesus rise from the dead? They are Dr. Antony Flew, considered by many to be the world's foremost philosophical atheist, a man who has authored more than 23 books, including Hume's Philosophy of Belief, God in Philosophy, Introduction to Western Philosophy, The Presumption of Atheism, and other philosophical essays on God, freedom, and immortality. My second guest is Dr. Gary Habermas, a renowned Christian philosopher and historian who's considered to be, by many, the foremost expert on the evidence, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Gary's authored 21 books, including The Historical Jesus, Ancient Evidence for the Life of Christ, In Defense of Miracles, and Why Believe God Exists. Gentlemen, we're glad that you are here. And we are moving on in terms of the case, Dr. Habermas, for Christians believing in the resurrection, the literal, physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, we have talked about hallucination. We've talked about there's 12 historical facts that have been accepted by all critical scholars. And we've even gone down to 4. I'd like to come back to a couple of those. One is some people doubt that Jesus actually died on the cross. In other words, Tony brought up at the beginning of the program, we haven't got a date for his birth. We haven't got a date toward the end. What about that? How do we know that Jesus actually died on the cross? Let's start with that. Do we have any other sources outside of the New Testament that nail that one down?
Well, I think on the case of crucifixion, you have data coming in from a variety of angles. First of all, medical data. You have critical data from scholars. You have extra-biblical data in a wide variety. I said earlier that John Dominic Ross and Marcus Borg, co-founders of the Jesus Seminar, both said that the fact that Jesus was crucified is as sure as any fact in the ancient world, certainly in the life of Christ. Why do they say that? Well, medical facts, real briefly, in a Journal of the American Medical Association article about 15 years ago, and there's many other dozens of medical articles, death by crucifixion is essentially death by asphyxiation. The centurion or any other person standing at a crucifixion does not have to have an EEG or an EKG. If you're hanging low on the cross for any amount of time, studies for volunteers actually show a cutoff point of about 12 minutes. If you're hanging low for any amount of time, you're not faking, you're dead. And you've got the problem of the spear in the side, which is in the Gospel of John, but which is confirmed from two other sources outside the Bible, one Roman, one Christian, that they did these things, that they offered a coup de grace. You've got David Strauss's critique, a famous critique, who said that if Jesus got off the cross and he was alive, you have a horrible problem, because if he shows himself to the disciples, you've got the problem that he's living, but he's not raised. And if they didn't believe he's raised, there's no Christianity. Now, that's some of the medicine. I told you about Borg and Crossan. Why do they think that? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and I think they take the Gospels very seriously here. But the extra-biblical data that you asked for, of the 17 extra-biblical, non-Christian sources within about 100, 150 years of the life of Jesus, 12 of them, roughly two-thirds, mention the cross and all kinds of details. And also, Paul's our number one scholar here.
Give me a couple of them. Give me a couple of the outside sources.
Outside sources. Tacitus mentions the fact that Jesus died on the cross. He said Pontius Pilate was the Judean procurator. He said that Tiberius was the governor. You have Lucian, the famous satirist, who called him a crucified sophist. You've got Marabar Serapion, who tells his son to emulate Jesus, who gave his life, and so on. Josephus, and a passage that, although it's disputed, virtually everybody believes the portion about the cross there, that he died, and Josephus also mentions Tiberius Caesar. So this is all right there. You've got some Gnostic sources that mention these things. You've got Thallus and Phlegon, two scholars that mention that the darkness surrounded the world when Jesus was crucified. So there's a bunch of them. And you've got Paul, that we both consider the best source here. Paul mentions the crucifixion of Jesus on several occasions and says that's his major preaching point.
Okay, the Quran says that Jesus didn't die on the cross. What would you say to those folks?
Well, first of all, the Quran has two passages, one that implies he did die, one that implies he did not die, but I'd say it's beside the point. The Quran is written in the 7th century. That's 6.5 centuries after the cross. By historical standards, I find it hard to believe that the Quran has much to contribute to an event that happened 6.5 centuries earlier.
What do you think, Tony?
Well, there's very... the prophet's knowledge of anything very much, but certainly knowledge of, say, the Old Testament, insofar as it existed in that form, is sketchy, to put it mildly.
And you accept the fact that he died on the cross.
Oh, gosh,
right?
yes.
In 1985, 15 years ago, we had a Q&A from the crowd, and one of the students said, they must have taken the wrong impression, but they said, so you believe Jesus didn't die on the cross? And I distinctly remember him calling the swoon theory rubbish.
Yeah. Now, John Dominic Crossan, although he would admit that Christ died on the cross, says he was probably laid over in some trash heap and torn apart by the dogs. He doesn't believe this tomb idea. Now, the tomb in which Jesus was buried, talk about that. What's the evidence?
Yeah, the burial.
Well, okay. First of all, let's get him buried. Was he buried in a tomb? What's the evidence for that?
Well, the interesting thing about Crossan is very few of his colleagues agree with him here. There's not a bit of evidence, not a bit, that says that Jesus was buried in an unknown plot and chewed up. And there's a lot of data to think that he was, let's put it this way, the data I'll get to in a second on the empty tomb all argues that he was buried in a separate plot. But there's not any data. And you know, it's usually the Christians. We are often thought of as Christians being put back on their heels saying, where's the data, where's the data? But I wonder where Dr. Crossan says he was buried in a common grave and chewed up by dogs. I think it's real easy. You say, give me one source.
All right, Tony, are we still on board on this one so far?
Well, I should have thought that this sort of detail is something which we're entirely dependent on the gospel evidence, aren't we? This sort of point.
Are we?
I disagree.
All right, why?
No, I disagree.
Talk to your buddy there.
Yeah, talk to my buddy.
Yeah,
all right. Two examples. Yeah. Acts 13, not the book of Acts, but in Acts there are a lot of creedal passages, small creeds. And in Acts 13, we are told that he was laid in a tomb and God raised him. So we have an empty tomb. Back to our buddy Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul uses a long sentence with what's called a triple hoti clause. In the Hebrew, it reads like, the Hebrew thinking, but in the Greek, it reads like this. Paul says, he died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried, and that he was buried, and that he was raised, and that he appeared. So if you've got a person who's dead, buried, raised, and appears, it's very hard to imagine that sequence without what going down is what's coming up. So I think Paul's very clear that what went down is what comes up. You've got this and, triple hoti clause. He died. He was buried. He was raised. He appeared. And you've got Philippians 3:11 again, ekanastasis, coming out from among the dead. How you can have that combination to be a Pharisee and believe that something comes down is not coming up, I think we do have Paul on the empty tomb.
Yeah, and that goes back, if you wrote it 55, he preached it in 51, and he got it from Peter in 35. Peter had to get it from someplace, and
That's
he
right.
said all the boys were preaching the same thing.
Sure. And you got that early text in Acts 13. But this is Paul on the empty tomb. I think we've got a number of other reasons for believing in the empty tomb also.
Why do you think that the evidence shows, okay, he was put into the tomb, why do you think that the tomb was empty on the third day or a few days after Christ died? Let's go the opposite direction.
Why do I think it was empty?
Yeah. In other words, what's the evidence that shows that it was empty?
Oh, I thought you were going to say, why was it emptied? I was going to say, because he's raised. Okay, evidence for the empty tomb. Well, the one hint I just gave is that we do have some early accounts, a creedal passage in Acts 13 and 1 Corinthians 15 on Paul's sequence, but a couple other things. The Jews admitted the empty tomb. And we have three sources, not just Matthew, but we have Justin Martyr and Tertullian. All three tell us that the Jews admitted the tomb was empty. The fact that Jesus died in the same city that the disciples did their earliest preaching, everybody realizes that early Christian preaching happened in Jerusalem. I don't know if there's anybody who disagrees with that. And yet, there's a problem. The city where he died is the city where they began preaching a few days later. If that tomb is full, don't you think somebody would say, fellas, we got a little problem here, this little matter of a body. So, bad place to be preaching. They should have been preaching in Galilee or Rome, but not Jerusalem. So you've got the city of Jerusalem as an evidence, you've got early attestation, you've got the Jews admitting it, and you know there's a critical historical principle. What your enemies admit is usually true. It's called the principle of enemy attestation. And I could throw some others in there too. If Rudolf Bultmann is right, and the New Testament, if the Gospels are Monday morning quarterbacking, reading ideas of 80-ish AD back into the Gospels, you don't pick women as your witnesses. And I don't want to offend people in the crowd here, but in the first century, a woman could not testify in a court of law. Jewish writing said women are liars. And the interesting thing is, Luke 24:11, when the women come back from the tomb and tell the disciples, Luke 24:11, they thought they were spreading gossip. They thought they were spreading tales. So if I'm writing this story and retrojecting it back from 80-ish AD to 30 AD, I don't pick women as my prime witnesses. So there's another big problem. Those are just some of the evidences for the empty tomb. You've got the women, you've got early attestation by Paul, you've got the Jews admitting it, and Jerusalem is the city. That's a big no-no. You don't preach in the city where the body's in the tomb. There's four that I'd love Tony to respond to.
All right, we're going to take a break, and Tony, when we come back, we'll let you respond. Stick with us. All right, we're back, and we're talking with two wonderful guests on the topic, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? We're talking with Dr. Antony Flew, considered by many to be the world's foremost philosophical atheist, and Dr. Gary Habermas, a renowned Christian philosopher and historian, considered by many to be the foremost expert on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. It's a fascinating discussion and a crucial discussion. And Tony, I want to know, what do you think about this evidence that Dr. Habermas just presented on the empty tomb? Do you go along with it?
I don't think you should be apologetic about this at all. These facts are facts, and I could rather wish that in these topics more people were prepared to face facts rather than run away and say, mustn't say that. No, this is a very impressive piece of argument, I think.
So you accept the empty tomb?
Well, I think this is an impressive testimony.
Thank you.
Because, it's very difficult to get round this.
But then now, it seems earlier, this just occurs to me, if the tomb is empty, what does that say to hallucination? Because hallucination would require that the body be in the tomb.
Well, yeah, the first question is, what happened to the body?
That's your question.
Well, in a thing where we have no independent witnesses, there are all sorts of ways of removing bodies. I'm not going to offer a theory to me because I simply don't think one can reconstruct a story of what happened in a city all that long ago when we haven't got the sort of evidence that one might have today with the invention of cameras and all the rest of it.
All right, now, Gary, in your book, let's stop right there, and I'll give a plug to your book, The Historical Jesus, all right?
Okay.
You've got a whole chapter on how Tony's friends, other naturalists, shot themselves in the foot by proposing all kinds of different ideas for what happened to the body. Right. Roll through it quickly in 2 minutes, hit some of the high spots.
Well, we've talked about some people say Jesus didn't die on the cross, although there's virtually no scholar out there who says that today. But if someone thinks Jesus didn't die on the cross, you've got the medical data, you've got to go with Paul, you have the extra biblical evidence, you've got the Gospels, you've got a lot of things. You asked him earlier, did the disciples lie? Of course, some people think, and he said no. Some people think the disciples stole the body and then lied about the appearances. Doesn't work because they were transformed. They died. Most of them died. They believed to be true. We've talked about hallucination, and that's an important theory because it's the one he holds. Some have said the whole thing is a legend. But the problem with the legend, one of the main problems is that you've got a man like Paul, that we have early data. And for legend theory to be true, you want to probably get that out of the hands of the eyewitnesses and removed a little bit past. I mean, for example, our two best biographies of Alexander the Great, written for 3 to 4 centuries after Alexander. And it's after that time that mythology starts creeping in. Miraculous stories about Alexander, which, by the way, are post-Christian. They come after Christ. And he lived in the 4th century BC. So for legend, when you've got early eyewitnesses, that's a real problem. So I think this data can respond with 6 or 8 refutations of every naturalistic theory. But I think that's important because the one that's been on the table tonight is hallucination. And I think the empty tomb is one more huge problem because now Tony has to have 2 of these theories. He's got to have hallucination. Well, actually, he's got to have 3. He's got to have one kind of hallucination for Paul, one kind of hallucination for the disciples. That's what he chooses. And now he's got a problem with the body in the tomb. Now, he's right. Bodies vacate tombs for different reasons. However, he's got to have the body vacating the tomb happening simultaneously with the disciples seeing the appearances. And, of course, he's got Paul later. So now he's starting to pile up these theories. And I think the more improbable theories you have, you're going to have a highly probable...
Didn't he write an article on that somewhere along the line?
Somewhere.
No, I'm not... sorry. Look, I'm not offering a naturalistic account of what happened. I'm not trying... I don't think it's possible to offer any satisfactory naturalistic account of what...
Except the 2 hallucination theories.
But I do think hallucination covers a lot of the data, but I don't offer anything to cover the empty tomb evidence.
Tony, do you think that do you believe in group hallucinations?
I don't see it's necessary to rule this out, but I think it's important to make a distinction that doesn't seem to have been made in the Gospels between a group of people seeing something severally and them seeing it together. Statements that these things were afterwards seen by the 12. This is not a categorical statement that they were all together when they had the experience.
What do you think, Gary?
I think Tony's getting himself in a lot of hot water. Number 1, he's got an empty tomb with no cause ventured for the tomb.
No.
Secondly, he's got hallucinations for the disciples that don't work for the half dozen reasons I gave earlier. Groups don't see hallucinations. They weren't in the right frame of mind. You have different times, places, people, gender, doing different things. The empty tomb... it doesn't transform lives. James, Paul, all reasons. Hallucinations are pretty rare. I tell you the conditions under which they occur. Bodily deprivation, or when someone's taking drugs, and these aren't the conditions of the disciples. So he says, no group hallucinations, but 10 or 20 people are having their own hallucinations without medical warrant. But he's got to have everybody having them. I think I just think it's a real issue.
All these things I've got to do if I was going to offer what I don't believe is possible for anyone to offer, a full naturalistic account of what was going on there.
But you're doing a good job, because he's got single hallucinations to everybody, hallucination to Paul.
Another thing that I've noted in the last 15 years is that there are 1 or 2 very spectacular cases of mass hallucinations. The supposed miracle of Fatima,
Or Medjugorje?
Not many people were involved. How many were
Yugoslavia.
involved? Yes, how many were involved?
Tens of thousands. But the only problem with these, and with Fatima, where people come with the so-called apparitions of Mary, is it's exactly the opposite of what the disciples are seeing. Because people go to Lourdes or to Fatima or to Medjugorje. You've got 10,000 people watching the children watch Mary. The only problem is the 10,000 people in the crowd don't see anything except they see signs in the heavens, but they don't see Mary. Of course, they don't see Jesus.
No, but the hallucination, the scene the ongoings in the heavens, weren't they?
That's an illusion, though, not an hallucination. If you're going to report that the sun is moving, remember Kent's differentiation between an illusion and hallucination?
Well,
an illusion is when you see something and think it's something else. An hallucination is when there's no objective referent. And so the people standing there in Medjugorje, they say they see signs in the heavens, but after all, there are stars, there are trees, there are mountains, there are sun. I mean, what they say is the sun was moving and the stars were moving, but it really is a sun and stars. That's far different from saying they saw Mary. I mean, my point is that at Medjugorje, 99.9% of the people do not see Mary.
No.
But with the disciples, you got the whole group seeing Jesus. So I just don't think it's an analogy. I think there's a real problem there using that. And I definitely don't think it's a mass hallucination, because it may be a mass illusion. But an illusion, once again, an illusion is when you see something, water on the highway, or take your hat off and put it on your bed at night and wake up and think someone's standing in your room, or a magician. Those are illusions. But hallucination is a much more radical concept. And hence what I'm saying, when he says 12 or 15 or 20 people have to have individual hallucinations, this is very radical, very tough to prove.
Okay, over the 15 years, Tony's been thinking about this. You've been thinking about Tony, haven't you?
Yes, I have been thinking about Tony.
What would you like to say to him?
Well, in a real special sort of way, because, folks, I've dialogued with a lot of atheists, a lot of skeptics. I've had 2- and 3- and 5-year correspondence. I've had 8-year correspondence right now with an agnostic. But Tony, I'm saying this sincerely, Tony is the kindest, most moral, most sincere, I'm serious, atheist that I know. And we've been friends for 15 years. I have photographs in 1985 of my 2-year-old daughter sitting on his knee. He would not let her go to bed till he gave her a goodnight kiss. She's 17 years old. We still have those photos before and after. I mean, he's a good guy. But I've also been praying for him for 15 years. Tony, nothing's impossible, buddy.
Look, at some stage, could we go back to St. Paul?
That's great.
As I understand it, what happened on the road to Damascus was that he had an experience, and nothing except appeared to his companions other than possibly they heard a voice.
All right, we're going to hold it right there. That'll be our question that we'll start off the next program with, and so join us. Be right back. Welcome. We're talking about the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? A very crucial question. And we've got 2 world-class philosophers with us. They are Dr. Antony Flew, considered to be by many to be the world's foremost contemporary philosophical atheist. A man who has authored more than 23 books, including Hume's Philosophy of Belief, God and Philosophy, Introduction to Western Philosophy, The Presumption of Atheism, and other philosophical essays on God, freedom, and immortality. And my second guest is Dr. Gary Habermas, a renowned Christian philosopher and historian who is considered by many to be the foremost expert on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And Gary has authored 21 books, including The Historical Jesus, Ancient Evidence for the Life of Christ, In Defense of Miracles, and Why Believe God Exists. Gentlemen, we are so glad that you are here. What we want to talk about in this section is a question that comes up time and time again. And that is, hey, my mom, my sisters, my family members, my friends, they might want to, Tony, believe in the resurrection, but doggone it, we don't see resurrections happening every day. Okay? All the funerals I've ever gone to, Dr. Habermas, I have yet to see any of those guys come back out of the grave. So my experience, all of my experience says dead men stay dead. And you want to take me from ground zero here of saying, you know, dead men stay dead, all the way up to a miracle, not just a little tiny miracle, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and I've got no experience, no background on that, baby. Now help me out.
Well, that's good. I mean, I think you've just explained well the issue that philosophers call antecedent probability. And I would guess that it's probably the single biggest issue on the miracles, not resurrection, but miracles issue. I think there's two ways a theist could go after this. One is to say, your view of the world is wrong. It's not that we're here and the resurrection is Mount Everest. This world here needs to be adjusted. Now, this isn't a debate on some of these other things, but if this were an extended debate and I would say, well, what's our world look like? I would want to talk about data for God's existence. I would want to talk about near-death experiences. And because, see, if God exists, the playing field rises up quite a bit. Or some would say like this. I mean, my colleague here, Dr. Flew, said in our 85 debate, he said if we have some reasons to think that God exists, the resurrection becomes enormously more likely. And I think those words, enormously more likely, are his words. So God would change that picture if there are miracles at present. I'm thinking about the double-blind study that was done with 400 cardiac patients at San Francisco Hospital a few years ago, in which they had a double-blind experiment. Half the people were prayed for, half the people were not prayed for, and they monitored these patients in 26 categories. And the ones that were prayed for were statistically better. Now that's significant, not just better, but statistically better, in 21 out of 26 categories. So this was published by Moody Monthly? No. It was published by the Southern Journal of Medicine. Nothing against Moody, but I mean, the peer reviewers of the Southern Journal of Medicine thought that this was medically significant, that the people who were prayed for were better in 21 out of 26 categories. As I said, near-death experiences. If life after death is true, and I think near-death experiences are a great argument, the playing field comes up. So one way you can do it is object to the playing field and say there's other things going on here too.
Let me give you an illustration, Tony. There was a farmer that grew up on the farm all of his life. Okay, the only animals he had ever seen were chickens, cows, and horses. And then one day he went to the zoo. And lo and behold, he walked around the corner and he saw a giraffe. And he looked at it, and he looked at it again, and he told his wife, there ain't no such animal. It was outside of his experience. Now, aren't you kind of like the farmer who's saying, you know, I got no resurrections in my experience here, but you're avoiding the very evidence that's standing in front of your eyes?
I don't think this will do, because the idea of a miracle is parasitical on the idea of a law of nature. To show that something is happening all the time and there's no reason to think it's impossible is not to produce anything that's going to change people's religious or other beliefs. You know, the whole point of arguing that this resurrection occurred is to say that it was impossible and could only have been brought about by a supernatural power. You know, if you, you know, we all know that giraffes are possible and very worthy creatures. So finding that, and there was never any good reason to think they were impossible anyway. So this is not going to prove anything exciting. I think that this is the crucial point, that the idea of a miracle depends absolutely on the idea of natural law and physical impossibility. It's only because there are laws of nature, there are things that are impossible for human beings, that it becomes exciting to say, here has something impossible has been done. It's not possible for human beings. It's only possible for a supernatural power.
All right, if I hear you right, let's say that I had the privilege of, it was a sad privilege, but I was asked to do a funeral. Mm-hmm. And I had known this lady, and so about a month ago, I flew down to Florida and did the funeral. About 3 weeks later, I came back to that area, and I was speaking, and the family was there again. And so I used the illustration and I said, what would happen if the daughter, who was a lawyer, came to me and said, you know, now this is after 4 weeks after her mother had been buried. She said, you know, I saw Mom and had lunch with her yesterday. Now, I think what you're saying is none of us would immediately, even if she's a lawyer, and even if she was a credible testimony, we would say, you know what, now that you've told me that, I need to put your mother's phone number back in my phone book. We do not assume that dead people come back from the dead. So let's stick it to Gary over here. How do we get to the point of coming to accept the fact that there could have been a resurrection in past history, namely Jesus Christ?
Well, like I said, there's two ways at least. And one is to say we have experience in nature of incredible things. Answers to prayer, healing, or near-death experiences. Near-death experiences arguing that life after death is true. On the other hand, you can argue that if she just said that, if the lawyer just said that, you'd say, that's not sufficient. But what if she kept going and giving you other data? Now, that's where I use my so-called Walmart
Tell us about
illustration. Yeah. In my Walmart illustration, let's say I bumped into somebody here. Now, we know what it's like to go to the store, and as you push your cart down the aisle, you say hi to this friend, and 2 aisles over, another friend, and 2 aisles over, 3 friends are talking together, and you join the group. What if I saw somebody at Walmart, and we chatted, and maybe I shook hands, and went a few aisles over, and somebody else was talking to this person, and a few aisles over, and 5 people were talking to this person, and I got into the conversation. But along the way, there were other signs. Let's say the person was tracking mud on their shoes. Let's say I reached over and touched the person and shook hands, patted them on the shoulder. Let's say I paused for a photograph. Now, what if, this is what's missing, what if that person, what if we saw that person last time at their own funeral 3 days or a week earlier? I'd say to myself, that's not the person we buried. I mean, I've seen the medical examiner's report. I know this person's dead. Okay, what are my options? It's a twin brother. And whatever, these are called naturalistic theories. But let's say the person says, no, you know I was injured in a serious car accident. Well, here's the scar. It's not a twin brother. It's me. And, well, maybe you're not here. Well, pinch me, pinch me. And I'm saying after a while, the mud on the feet, the pat on the shoulder, there's going to come a point at which you say, boy, I don't know what to do here, but I have a medical report. I was at your funeral. I saw the car accident. There's a scar on your head. You've been my best buddy for 3 years. And now, as you ask the other people, did you see him over there? Did all of you see him? Did you see him singly? Well, it might have been a hallucination. Did you see him in groups? Okay, now, did anybody else touch him? I'm saying the second way to go after this is there reaches a point at which you say, this doesn't fit my experience, but it seems to be the same person. And I think that's roughly the same way that he likes the case of Thomas. I mean, I think that's Thomas's point. There's no way this guy's walking around a Walmart. So he says, check it out. And Paul says, I'm going to kill all of them. Well, he sees Jesus. James says, no way. I'm saying that the second way to go after it is to say there can be so much data that it overrides what we think the natural scheme of nature is. And I'll add this about the laws of nature. Laws of nature aren't some Humean, or let's say some Newtonian principle, and Hume is better than Newton, but they're not something that keep things from happening. Laws of nature are statistical descriptions of what usually occurs when nature is left to herself, to quote Lewis. Since they are statistical descriptions and not rock walls, not cement walls, statistics can be overridden. And therefore, I've got to be open that the guy at Walmart was the same guy at the funeral. At least have to be open to that.
What do you think, Tony?
Well, I don't think it's a thing to go on about here, but I radically disagree with this idea that laws of nature are merely statistical. I want to go back to the point that a miracle is an overriding of a law of nature, well, or if you like, of doing something that is known to be practically impossible for human beings. And I think there can be evidence for this, but it depends on your having justified prior beliefs not merely about the existence of a supernatural power, but a fair amount of supplementary belief about the nature of and the intentions of that supernatural power. Just to say, there must have been a sort of personal force at the beginning that set off this. What is really wanted and is available, surely, in this particular case that we're arguing about, is the whole tradition of Mosaic theism. It's not just God as a superpower, omnipotent power. It is the God of the whole tradition of Mosaic theism, i.e. the God of the Old Testament.
Okay, Gary,
and
30
it's the
seconds.
belief in that that I think is going to make belief in these miracles rational belief.
I agree, but in the last segment we were talking about Jesus plugging in to the God of that tradition, saying, I'm the Son of God, I'm the Son of Man. Then he rises from the dead with all its evidence. It's precisely plugging into that tradition, which is the strongest argument for Jesus being who he claimed to be. So if he's raised, you've got somebody who claims to be the Son of God, and God doesn't raise heretics from the dead.
All right, we're debating the topic, did Jesus rise from the dead? And when we return, we're going to talk some more about this, and we're going to talk about other evidence that might push you over the edge in terms of belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Stick with us. Welcome. We're talking with Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Antony Flew. And Gary, what other evidence would you bring into this picture in terms of those that are naturalists that say there's got to be a naturalistic explanation? Tony doesn't seem to know how to explain this stuff, the evidence, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection that you've presented so far, but his concern is, hey, just in the ordinary experience of things, it couldn't happen. Now, what would you say to that?
Yeah, the other way I said, one is just overpowering evidence for the resurrection, but the other way to go after it is to say, this world admits other exceptions. Now, near-death experiences, to give you an example, would not be a miracle. However, if near-death experiences evidence an afterlife, Jesus' resurrection would still be unique, but if people are living after death, now that makes you take a whole new look at the resurrection. So my interest in near-death experiences is not the tens of thousands, if Gallup is right, almost 8 million Americans that have had near-death experiences. My interest is not the tunnels and the lights, because that could be temporal lobe, it could be lack of oxygen. To me, since 1972, I've collected almost 100 cases of near-death experiences where something evidential happens 2 blocks, or in some cases 2 miles away. Now, if I just give one example, this is a real recent one, but the medical doctor, a cardiologist, said in his Michael Sabom, in his 1982 book, Recollections of Death, A Medical Perspective, he said, when I wrote that book, we only had near-death experiences. Now we have post-death experiences. In his most recent book called Light and Death, he gives the case of a southern mother in her 30s who had a brain aneurysm. And they had to fly her out to Arizona for a special technique. And I'm given to believe, it seems like only one doctor in the world does this, but it took 30 doctors and technicians in the room. And what happens is, he opened up her skull, and if the aneurysm is right there, you repair it. But if it goes down deep, they put into effect what they call Operation Standstill. And this is crazy because they basically killed their patient. Now, this lady went out to Arizona. He cut open her skull, went down and found this thing is way too deep. So they had to kill her. And what they did was cool her body temperature down to 9 degrees, get all the blood out of her head. They stopped her heart. They stopped her brain. These were stopped for hours. And he's doing his work, and to make a long story short, if you're interested in the end result, he got the vessel, he repaired it, and she is doing fine today. Okay. But what the interesting thing is, in her testimony, when she heard the saw turn on, she said she was out of her body, and as it were, over his shoulder at the top of her head. Now, she's getting near to this point where they're going to kill her, and she gives 6 points of corroboration. And one of the things she says is, she said, I had this idea of a drill looking like a pizza cutter or something, but she said it looked like a pen with a little tiny, where'd you get that? And she said, you had a socket wrench next to you. And the medical doctor said, what do you mean socket wrench? And he's wanting her to give evidence. He said, there's this a box that sat open with all these interchangeable parts. He said, draw me a picture of the drill. She drew it. Draw me a picture of the socket set. She drew it. And then she tells things that went on in the room. They couldn't find her artery. They had to go to the other side. She identified which doctor made the decision, which doctor couldn't find the artery. It's in her medical report. But during the experience, and then they kill her. I mean, she's dead for 3 hours, and she has all these points of memory. And I want to give others, but in one other case, real briefly, a girl who was drowned. She was underwater for 19 minutes. She reported what her parents were doing at home that night, what her mom did for dinner, where her dad was sitting, a G.I. Joe that her brother played with, a doll that her sister played with. She talked about a popular song that came on the television, in the radio, and she gave this, she was no brain activity, comatose. She came to 3 days later, looked up and told the doctor, you're the one that resuscitated me, told him this big long story, and he checked the data from just 3 days earlier. Now, I think these are some hard cases, and there's dozens of others like them. Now, if this is true, and there's life after death, this isn't Jesus, but if there's life after death, it allows us to understand a model for what we call resurrection.
Tony?
This is supposed to show life after death, is it?
Well, I think, not extenuated life, not heaven, hell, but what I would argue is minimalistic life after death. By minimalistic life after death, I mean minutes, sometimes hours, minutes, after cessation of heart or brain waves. Now, to me, if a person's recording something, if it's in my medical report that I flatlined at 3:02, and I had no brain wave at 3:15, and I report something that happened a few minutes after that, or an hour later, and I can tell you what went on, say a police report, and it's after the event. No, I don't think life after death in the traditional view of heaven and hell, but in the sense of having data for minutes after death. And I would think life after hours of death would be tough for a naturalist.
Tony, does that open up the door in terms of the possibility of more than naturalism?
Not really, I think, but this is another subject. It's one of my subjects, actually. I've written a lot of the literature about
what would you
the
say
impossibility of a future life.
What would you say happened in terms of those cases, then,
There's
naturalistically?
somebody that can report something miles away when they have no heart or brain activity.
I mean, this is the sort of thing that's normally called out-of-the-body experiences, isn't it?
Except in an OBE, the person's not anywhere close to death. In an NDE, they're close to death. And in the case of this lady from Alabama, I think, or Georgia, she's post-death by all accepted standards. 59 degrees blood, no blood in the head, no heart, no brain for hours. She shouldn't be reporting anything, should she?
No, but if she was really dead, she shouldn't be recovering in this way.
This is intriguing evidence for somebody who has no brain activity. She was on a lung machine. Yeah. By the way, her doctor gave her a 10% chance of living and a 1 in 10,000 chance of living with all her faculties. 3 days later, she comes to spontaneously and says, you're the guy that resuscitated me. Where's the tall guy without the beard? He said, I'll get him for you. Now, this guy's an agnostic, and I've talked to the doctor myself. Guess what? He's no longer an agnostic. He's a theist. He's not a Christian, but he's a theist. So it's evidence for something.
Yes, I mean, this is the sort of thing that societies for psychical research, or nowadays it's called parapsychology, investigate. And it seems to me one begins to start talking about, not psychokinesis, extrasensory perception and so on.
But you don't believe in ESP?
No.
Okay, so what does a naturalist do with reports from miles away when there's no brain and heart activity?
I don't know about this one. I know what to do with most ESP reports, because basically people again and again try to establish evidence for this. And the only way that will demonstrate this is a repeatable demonstration.
But of course all these people have functioning brains and hearts.
Oh, yeah. And this
so
is
again, a person with
angle.
no brain and heart, this is...
Oh, no. This is
quite extraordinary.
This is a new one to me, yes.
Okay, well...
This is certainly a new one.
All right, we have to wrap this up. Gary, In terms of all that we've been talking about, fit near-death experiences in, where does it fit? What is the evidence showing you so far?
Well, what I'm saying is something we haven't even talked about. But Christians want to talk about a theistic worldview. As Tony said, it's not just God out there, it's the God of the Old Testament. There's a whole tradition here. So if we've got good arguments for God's existence, if we have evidence for God writing Scripture, if we have evidence for Him acting in time, if Jesus does miracles, then He rises from the dead. And if today we see cases of double-blind experiments where we can't answer, a medical journal publishes answers to prayer, where 21 out of 26 categories the person is statistically better. We see some healing examples, which I wish we had time to go into, near-death experiences, and then we talk about the evidence for the resurrection. I think the Christian's point is the resurrection is not isolated. It's part of a big picture, what we would want to call a theistic worldview. It's part of a big picture. And in that picture, the fact that Jesus is extraordinary, it's one of a kind, it shows Jesus is who He said He is, but He's alive. God's working in other ways in the world too.
All right, please stay with us. You won't want to miss what's coming next. We're going to have questions from the audience, so hang in there.